Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. The first of which is just to move my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week, move in a process of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason for doing these, and the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason, to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. So that's why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is, I was going to say August, but it's not August yet, July 30th, 2017, the 8th Sunday after Pentecost this time around, our assigned text once again comes out of Matthew chapter 13. We've been in Matthew chapter 13 for a few weeks now. Dealing with parables. This one is split again. It's verses 31 through 33 and then 44 through 52. As I just mentioned, parables. The last 2 weeks we've had parables, but there's some differences this time around. The last 2 weeks in a row we've had longer parables that Jesus tells, and then we've also had the benefit of Jesus offering an explanation to the disciples of what he's talking about. This time around it's a little different. We have 5 mini parables this time around. Each one is just a verse or two long, so quite short in terms of their overarching length and teachability, and there's no then explanation offered on the part of Jesus for this. So this one's a little bit different this time around, yeah, so that's what it is. Now, there's an interesting combo in terms of setting. Again, all of this is set within one chapter that's oftentimes called the parable discourse because there's so many of them in there. The first two that are offered in the first section, the 31 through 33, are still offered to the crowds. And in fact, they occur setting-wise between Jesus actually saying one of the longer parables and then going into the house and explaining it to the disciples, so that these two smaller ones are part of a larger batch that he offers, and then apparently the disciples just want to know what one. So there's that, and then the second part, the verses 44 through 52, occur in the setting of when Jesus is actually beginning to explain things to his disciples, and it almost seems perhaps with that setting that these smaller parables are part of his larger description of a different one. So that's kind of an interesting point. But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it, and then I'll kind of talk about the different ones, and we'll go with that. So chapter 13, verses 31 through 33, and then 44 through 52. He, being Jesus, put before them, being the crowds, another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of the shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Okay, now we're going to skip ahead. And keep in mind that now we've gone into the house and the setting is now just talking with the disciples. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. And on finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it on shore, sat down, and put the good into the baskets, but threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all this? They answered, yes. And he said to them, therefore every scribe who has been trained in the kingdom of heaven is like the master of the household, who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. When Jesus had finished these, oh no, that's it. Okay. It ends there. So that's the reading this time around. So we've got these 5 little parables, and then we've got just a tiny little bit of narration at the end. I did mention at the beginning here that these ones don't have descriptions. That last one does seem to have just a tiny little bit of a description, and it's kind of apocalyptic in nature. And we've kind of heard this, especially last week with the weeds and the wheat. We heard that in the end, during the harvest, that which is bad will be separated out and will be thrown away and burned, but that we are not the ones who do that. We hear the same sort of thing here, that in the end, the separation of the good from the bad will happen, and the angels will be the ones who do it. And again, not us, but it's in the end. And in this case, it's being referred to a net that catches a whole slug of fish, and some are good and desirable, and some are bad and crappy, and so they separate them out. So that's kind of what's happening there. So and so that's one of the 5 parables, the only one of this that's got that little bit of description. There's a couple of different seeming focal points of these different these different parables. The first 2 can very much be grouped together. The second 2 can very much be grouped together, and depending on your point of view, maybe the last one can be grouped with those, with the 3rd and 4th one, or maybe it kind of stands on its own. But we hear in the mustard seed and then the yeast that the kingdom of heaven is invasive. If you think about yeast and what it does, how yeast helps dough to rise, and it changes kind of the condition of the bread that you're making. That's one thing that we say here. And if you're familiar with farming and mustard plants, I am, having a farming background. It's a weed, and it's a very invasive weed, one that will spread quite a bit and take stuff over if you let it. That speaks to this invasive nature. And yet at the same time, both of these have surprising little twists to them if we consider a little bit deeper than just face value. If we think about a mustard plant, Jesus says in here that it's the smallest of all seeds, which no, it's not, but okay. And it grows up to become the greatest of all plants and even becomes a tree. Well, no, it doesn't. Mustard does not become a tree. It may become a good-sized bundle of viney, thorny weed that could resemble a bush, but it's not going to become a tree. It just isn't. It's never going to get that big. The plant itself will not get that big. And yet Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is invasive. Maybe it's a little bit prickly, and it will grow through. And the surprising thing is that we'll get much bigger than expected. Nature says that a mustard plant will get X big. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is going to get way bigger and way larger. So there's that. Then if we look at the whole yeast situation, and it's hidden in there, and our English translation doesn't do such a great job of it, but 3 measures of flour is like 60 pounds of flour. Think of how much bread that makes. Think of how much baking you can do with that. And also it's excuse me, it's just a tiny bit of yeast, and it's interesting that the woman hides it in their, again, translation situations here, but this tiny little bit of yeast is going to affect an enormous amount of flour, so much more than we would ever expect it to actually do. So that's kind of that same notion as the mustard plant becoming a tree, that what we think should be possible, the limits of our understanding, the limits of what we can expect, will be exceeded by this invasive kingdom that affects us in some way. So that's kind of that first portion, and some interesting notions of those first 2. Now, if we go on to the second one, we're looking more at the idea that the kingdom of heaven is beyond measure, or its worth is beyond measure. It's worth more than all else that can be discovered accidentally, or it can be discovered when we go looking for it. So we've got the parable of the guy who finds a treasure hidden in a field. Kind of makes you wonder what he's doing in the field if he doesn't own it. But he finds this treasure, so he goes off and sells everything he has to buy this chunk of land so that he can access the treasure. And then we have the guy who is searching for pearls, and in the searching for pearls, generic, he finds one that's so incredible that he sells all he can just to get that one pearl. And so this speaks of the kingdom of heaven its worth is beyond everything else. And so that's kind of the sense that I get from those 2 micro parables. And then the last one that I already kind of talked about with the fish, that that the fisherman throws the net, not knowing what they're going to catch, what's going to be caught, and they catch the good along with the bad. And that's, to me, is reminiscent of the weeds and the wheat from last week, if you happen to catch that video. But there's kind of a real similar sensibility there. So maybe the takeaway this time around with all of these 5 different micro parables is Jesus is telling us that the kingdom of heaven is like a lot of things. And 3 years ago, when I preached on this passage, that was kind of what I focused on. That the amazing thing about parables is we all hear something different. We all understand it differently because of our own experience, and the people who would have heard Jesus say it on that day are going to understand it differently than perhaps we do now because of the different experiences. What I might hear as good news, someone else might hear as not so good news. So it's very much like, how do you hear it? What do you hear? What do you understand? What do you take away from this? And what's interesting is when Jesus wraps it up, that last portion of when he's addressing the disciples directly, and he asks them, "Have you understood this?" This is the kind of wrap up of all these parables, and the little bit of narrative that's left in chapter 13, which is 4 or 5 more verses, is then back into narrative, and Jesus goes to his hometown and does some more teaching. But so this is kind of the wrap up, and he asks them, "Do you understand this?" And they reply, "Yes." And then he talks about the scribes and how they hope to understand the treasures of heaven. And yet I think about that, and if Jesus posed that question to me, and I think about all of these different parables, these 5 along with the other bigger ones that we've had the last couple of weeks, and just my sensibility about trying to understand the truth about the kingdom of heaven that Jesus is putting alongside of something else. He says, "Do you understand it?" And I want to respond, "I think so. So yes, but no." and at times I think that's okay, that we recognize that we kind of understand, we get these little glimpses, and we kind of clue in just a little bit, and yet it's still bigger than we can understand, and bigger than we can really put our fingers on. But so that's one way that I look at all these. And another way that I've been considering is the motivation behind the person in each parable. Think about, okay, so we got the person who goes and plants the mustard seed. And that's in there. He went and he sowed mustard into his field, which to me is foolish and dumb. Who does that? Again, with the weeds and the wheat, it was an enemy that did that. But we don't hear that in this one. And so we raise the question, well, if the kingdom of heaven is like this plant that grows and expands and takes everything over and becomes way bigger than it's supposed to be, who plants that seed? Who's that planting? If we think about the woman who is mixing the yeast into this ginormous thing, and it works far more than it should, who is that woman that is doing that within the parable? Who is the person who stumbles across the treasure and sells everything in order to achieve that treasure, as well as the pearl? And who is the person who is fishing? And this is a take that I've never really taken. A take that I've never really explored before is who is that? Who is that person? And that's a question that, especially with parables, I always try to ask of who do I relate to, or who is this supposed to be? And I find myself wondering, is that God? Is God the one who is planting the seeds of the kingdom that will expand and become way bigger than it has any right to? Is God the one who sees us as the treasure or the pearl and is willing to give everything in order to obtain it? Because, hey, that's what Jesus did. And is God the one who is collecting everything, both the good and the bad, and will somehow separate it? And is God the person in each micro parable? And I'm very interested in exploring that as well. So I think that might be the direction I go with the sermon. So there's a lot happening in these 5 little micro parables. Any one of them could probably be a sermon on its own. either pairing or either grouping could be a sermon on its own, or trying to talk about the whole thing could be a sermon on its own. It's interesting, and we'll see where it goes. Clearly, I still have some more thinking to do on it. But if you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, throw them down in the comment section. We'll continue it that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week. If you are a regular viewer, won't have videos the next couple of weeks. I'm actually going to be off for a couple of weeks, so we'll pick things back up again here about the middle of August. So I hope you have a blessed couple of weeks, and we will catch you next time.